Disclaimer. This discussion does not attempt to discharge Adolf Hitler from the atrocities he incited and the heinous acts that affected millions. This is a general overview of the ideologies and psychologies that existed at this time that may have, in some part, contributed to the horrors that the Nazi regime inflicted. This video discusses topics such as the Holocaust, forced sterilization, and others that may be disturbing to some. Please consider this a trigger warning. Disgust-sensitivity is a controversial topic, particularly in its relation to the Nazi regime and other fascist dictatorships across history. In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into its associated neurological and psychological traits and explore how a highly disgust-sensitive society could potentially find itself committing violent, heinous acts against those it deems inferior. Where can we see these traits in the right-wing nationalism so prevalent in Germany in the first half of the 20th century, the Nazi regime, and Hitler's own psychology? We're going to get into that in this video. Let's go. According to Wikipedia, disgust is an emotional response of rejection or revulsion to something potentially contagious or something considered offensive, distasteful, or unpleasant. Disgust is experienced primarily in relation to the sense of taste, either perceived or imagined, and secondarily to anything which causes a similar feeling by a sense of smell, touch, or vision. Research continually has proven a relationship between disgust and anxiety disorders, such as arachnophobia, blood injection injury type phobias, and contamination fear-related obsessive-compulsive disorder. Beyond the Wikipedia definition, and further to its evolutionary role, the feeling of disgust benefited the human race in two major ways. Core disgust was meant to keep us from ingesting something potentially poisonous or dangerous, while social or moral disgust caused us to use caution when interacting with other groups outside of our own, in the instance that they would bring disease with them to the so-called in-group. A 2017 study published by the American Psychology Association states that recent neurological research displays that core disgust, the kind that prevents us from eating rotten food, and moral and social disgust, that can be experienced in varying ranges across certain people, ethnicities, or races, elicit activation in overlapping brain areas. This results in those with an extreme high degree of disgust sensitivity being much more closely associated with upholding a clear and concise moral separation between us and them, and may be more concerned with ideologies that work to bind the us together. A study published by the journal Psychological Science stated, consistently, those with higher scores on disgust sensitivity relate not only to more negative views of an outgroup, but also to more positive perceptions of the in-group. At the core of the Nazi regime was the belief that the Germanic Aryan race, epitomized by tall, blonde, blue-eyed people, was the master race. But the Nazis also believed in many different versions of the divine origins of their people. The push of Adolf Hitler and his right hand, Heinrich Himmler, for research into the history and prehistory of the German people not only worked to strengthen existing nationalism, but also created the sense of a divine lineage, particularly in contrast to those races they deemed inferior. Incorporated into and advertised freely through Nazi mainstream media were stories, sagas, and legends of the Germanic people, likening them to the great empires of the Greeks and the Romans. They also deemed themselves the sole proprietors of cultural diffusion, a phenomenon whereby influences, ideas, and models were passed on by more advanced peoples to the less advanced with whom they came into contact. Nazi archaeology was heavily funded and relied upon for confirmation of German superiority. This went so far as to twist the interpretation of famous artifacts such as the Bayeux Tapestry and claiming indigenous rock art in Sweden as Proto-German. In order to further the notion of unadulterated Germanic might, the most well-known Nazi theorist Alfred Rosenberg, who led many of these expeditions, also believed that the Germans were descended from the inhabitants of Atlantis. No, not that one. This one. Germans were not only physically superior to the rest of the world, but also in their mental capacities and their will to live, whatever that means. Himmler is quoted as saying, "A nation lives happily in the present and the future, so long as it is aware of its past and the greatness of its ancestors." This incessant fascination with the idea of themselves as the origins of culture and as being descended from godlike equivalents subscribes to the disgust-sensitive notion of the in-group as superior to the out-group, of which the rest of the world belongs. A 2007 study published by the Psychology Department at the University of Wyoming found that high disgust sensitivity had a specific and robust association with contamination concerns and disease avoidance commonly observed in obsessive compulsive disorder. Clearly, Adolf Hitler himself had a host of mental health issues, which are noted as, but not limited to, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and of course, psychopathy. But the idea that he also had undiagnosed OCD is not surprising. Hitler bathed 4 times a day and was neurotic regarding hygiene. At the core, the essential anti-Semitic Nazi metaphor of Germany as the body and Jews as the contaminant reflects this immunological disgust and fear of contamination. The Germanic people as a whole were seen as the extended immune system, and anything outside was considered a threat. Keeping the outside threat out was one thing, keeping the German people as healthy as possible in order to perpetuate their racial profile was another. Tobacco and alcohol were harshly frowned upon, and anti-smoking and anti-alcohol propaganda was rampant. Most of this rhetoric was directed at pregnant women, who were warned that the ingestion of these would harm the offspring. This was not out of concern for the individual well-being of the child, but necessary for the continuation of the German pure body as a whole. Physical cleanliness and moral and racial purity are inextricably linked, and we see this in every aspect of the Nazi ideology on health. Between 1918 and 1930, a moral panic was aroused in Germany known as the Black Horror on the Rhine. This was based on national propaganda that espoused that Senegalese and North African soldiers who arrived during the French occupation of Rhineland were committing heinous, violent sexual crimes on white German women and spreading venereal disease. When this myth was rightfully debunked, German women were blamed for having voluntary relations with the foreign officers and ruining the purity of the German race as they became pregnant with mixed-race children. This perpetuated and reiterated the belief that you could not be German unless your skin color was white. These children, known from then on as the Rhineland bastards, regardless of their parents' marital status, were then as teenagers systematically sterilized by Hitler's Third Reich under the idea that they compromised the continuity and purity of the German race and were therefore forbidden to procreate. Here, the disgust-sensitive obsessions with cleanliness and purity collided in a xenophobic and hate-driven atrocity. The fear and hate from a highly disgust-sensitive society that believed so-called lower races could literally infiltrate and contaminate the perceived higher race could not be more clear. A study published in 2019 by the journal Cognition and Emotion states that this trait of a highly disgust-sensitive person or society encourages a more broad search for structure, which, in turn, endorses political positions that aim to maintain societal order. From the thousands of Nazi soldiers goose-stepping in perfect unison to their notoriously meticulous record-keeping, the Third Reich epitomized orderliness. Not unlike other fascist or dictatorship-led societies, Nazism flourished under a strong sense of order, of all its inhabitants as inherently one. Hannah Arendt, a Jewish author at the Nuremberg trials, coined the term banality of evil to describe the horrors inflicted by Adolf Eichmann, a prominent SS member whose defense at trial was that he was simply following orders. While looked down upon by many of her peers for suggesting that pure evil was not behind the acts committed by Eichmann and Nazi soldiers, Arendt's work attempted to put forth that Eichmann's need to follow orders in its twisted extreme allowed him to perpetuate unadulterated violence against those that did not conform to the perceived natural hierarchy of his society. In a world where no man, woman, or child was an individual, free to make their own choices and enact their own identities, but instead was part of a perfectly ordered mechanism, this so-called banality of evil was allowed to flourish. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like and subscribe, and leave me a comment down below to let me know what you think. And I'll see you in the next one.